Hello students, today we're going to learn about jazz music and part of the 1920s. There is an assignment that will be posted up on Google Docs. You can work on that while this PowerPoint is playing. First thing I want you to do is for the do now, take a look at this picture. And the question is, what does the photograph suggest about how society changed during the jazz age? This is a depiction from F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, a book that I think most of you read last year with Miss Corona, so you should be familiar with this and maybe seen the film, but you know about the 1920s and take a guess as to what's going on here, how life changes in the United States. Okay, so posted up are the pages that you will have to read in order to answer the questions. I will read them to you and you can play it. That way, in case you have a hard time reading, you can at least hear my voice and know what's going on. So that's a picture of a jazz band playing in 1963. And I'll read off. It seems that every generation chooses to rebel against previous ones, partly through the rhythms and melodies of new styles of music. In the 1950s and 1960s, the rebellious music of choice was rock and roll, described as savage music in an advertisement by the Citizens Council of Greater New Orleans. In the 1980s and 1990s, rap and hip-hop came on the scene, once again rattling the sensibilities of older generations. You know, like NWA, Public Enemy, those groups were ridiculed by the media as terrible music that was hurting the youth, and jazz will have a similar effect in the 1920s. Though they are each unique, rock, rap, and hip hop are cousins, bearing family resemblances because they are all descended from an earlier musical and social revolution, the birth of jazz and the blues. The origins of jazz. New Orleans is generally considered to be the birthplace of jazz, a city like no other. In the late 1800s, New Orleans was home to an extremely diverse population of whites, African Americans, and people of mixed races. In this cultural whirlwind could be heard the sounds of music that had originated with enslaved people who worked in the cotton fields. The music was based on traditional African work songs and field hollers. Work songs often had a call and response structure, with one person singing a line and the other people singing a response. Field hollers were high-pitched calls used by individuals working alone to communicate with workers in other fields. Late in the 19th century, New Orleans also hosted a lively European classical music scene with several well-attended opera houses. At this time, new kinds of sounds emerged that blended various African and European influences. By the turn of the 20th century, the strains of jazz could be heard streets of New Orleans. Two key features stood out as hallmarks of the jazz style: syncopation and improvisation. Syncopation is the temporary placement of stress on normally weak beats in a piece of music to create a complex rhythm. Improvisation is the act of composing and performing music on the spot. Modern-day jazz styles still feature catchy syncopated rhythms and dizzying original riffs improvised by performers. Maybe you went over that with Mr. Collier Hartman at some point. Next stop, Chicago. If New Orleans was the birthplace of jazz, Chicago was its nursery. In the 1910s and 1920s, many African Americans migrated north in search of better economic opportunities, the Great Migration. Jazz musicians were part of this trend, and some of the most notable musicians landed in Chicago. Joe King Oliver was one of the best known New Orleans transplants, playing with King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band on Chicago's South Side. Today, Oliver is remembered not only for his own musical accomplishments, but also for hiring one of the jazz's legendary greats for his band, trumpet player Louis Armstrong. Also originally from New Orleans, brought the art of improvisation to new heights. Ron David, the author of Jazz for Beginners, describes Armstrong this way: he built his improvisations like songs within a song, and his trumpet sound glowed. Also a singer, Armstrong had a distinctive vocal style and specialized in scatting, or singing improvised melodies and meaningless syllables. Okay, I will direct you to a YouTube video to watch a song performed by Louis Armstrong. The jazz cause spread like wildfire among diverse audiences in the 1920s, a decade now known as the Jazz Age. Young people flocked to nightclubs in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, right here in South Central there are some nightclubs, and other cities to hear jazz and to dance in ways their elders considered immodest. One of the most popular dances of the Jazz Age was the fast-paced, energetic Charleston, which featured quick, kicking steps. Okay, now we can learn about the women of jazz. The female jazz musicians who have received the most acclaim are the great vocalists of the swing era and later, such as Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday and Lena Horne. Fitzgerald was a master of scatting, using her voice to weave complex improvised melodies around the beat of the band. Holiday, named Lady Day, was known for her soulful and moving ballads. Horne, a dancer, singer, and actress, became one of the top African American performers of her time, appearing in theater, movies, and on television. She refused to accept any acting roles that stereotyped African American women, and she became an activist in the civil rights movement. Other lesser known but equally talented female jazz musicians include Lil Hardin and Mary Lou Williams. Born in 1898, Hardin was a pianist and composer. She started her career in New Orleans, where she played, wrote, and arranged music for several bands. After moving to Chicago, she played for King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. She was married to Louis Armstrong from 1924 to 1938 and collaborated with him on a number of recordings. Williams was born in 1910 and was a composer, arranger, pianist, bandleader, whose work spanned several musical genres. During the swing era, she wrote and arranged pieces for Duke Ellington's band. Later, she worked in the style called bebop, which grew out of swing. Swinging on. A style of jazz called swing, which had a lively rhythm and was played by larger ensembles called big bands, became popular during the 1930s and 1940s. Some music scholars consider the swing era the golden age of jazz, and many would nominate Duke Ellington as the king of swing. Ellington was a bandleader, pianist, and composer. His songs such as It Don't Mean a Thing are still recorded today. It don't mean a thing, she ain't got to swing. Alright, you should listen to the song. During the swing era, most big bands were segregated. The white bandleader Benny Goodman was one of the few who hired both black and white musicians. Like many other successful bandleaders, Ellington was African American. Even though his band toured nationally and played to both black and white audiences, Ellington and his musicians continually faced the possibility of being turned away from a gig because of the color of their skin. The Cotton Club. Further below. If you were trendy, fashionable, famous, or just hoping to hear some stellar jazz in 1920s New York City, the Cotton Club was the place to go. In this legendary nightclub, white audiences displayed a strange mix of admiration and disdain toward the conventionally African-American art form of jazz and those who performed it. Located in Harlem, the Cotton Club had its heyday between 1922 and 1935. All workers and entertainers at the club were African Americans, but the clientele were exclusively white. So, the performers are black, people that work there are all black, but the people that go to watch the show and enjoy and be entertained are white. The club's decor reflected a stylish plantation environment, and the staff were dressed to reflect management's idea of enslaved people or plantation workers. So think about that, all like things to make white people feel superior, kind of like when we looked over blackface. Despite the segregation and offensive depiction of African Americans, some of the greatest African American jazz artists of the period played at the Cotton Club. Duke Ellington's orchestra performed as the house band between 1927 and 1931, after which the orchestra of another jazz great, Cab Calloway, took over. Cotton Club guest performers included Louis Armstrong, Ethel Waters, Lena Horne, and many other outstanding African American musicians. Weekly radio broadcasts from the club brought their music to a national audience. The Cotton Club moved to a new location after the Harlem riots of 1935, but it never regained its ranking as the premier New York nightclub. In 1940, it closed its doors for good. And think about it, how do you think the Cotton Club helped both helped and harmed the cause of African Americans? So there's like a two-edged sword here. On one hand, it was great. On the other hand, there were some problems. Jazz and the Flapper. One popular image of the jazz age is the flapper, a young woman who bobbed her hair, sported a wide lipstick outline smile, and wore a short, straight-waisted dress. Often she was portrayed dancing. Flappers were generally young white working women living in cities. As the economy improved in the 1920s, more jobs began opening up for women in offices and department stores and on telephone switchboards. At the same time, women had gained the right to vote. These changes helped produce a generation of newly independent-minded young women. Flappers abandoned the restrictive clothing of earlier times and adopted higher hemlines, bright colors, and cosmetics, makeup. In the evenings after work, they could be found dressed in daring new clothing styles and dancing to jazz music in nightclubs. They also engage in smoking and drinking, activities formerly associated almost exclusively with men. Not surprisingly, the flappers and their culture drew the condemnation of an outraged older generation. You youngsters and your clothing. The president of the Christian Endeavor Society, for example, called jazz dancing an offensive against woman purity. Nevertheless, even though the flappers' signature style faded away after the 1920s, their spirit of independence and youthful energy was passed on to the generations that followed. And fun fact, flappers is also the derogatory term used towards the Primera Flats gang here in South Central LA. And finally, jazz today. The popularity of jazz declined after the swing era, but the genre still has many dedicated fans and has evolved in a variety of directions. Some musicians have fused elements of jazz with the sounds of Latin and Caribbean music, while others have incorporated electronic instruments such as synthesizers and digital technology to move jazz into new realms. Still, others continue to explore new ways to perform the classics of Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Benny Goodman, and other jazz greats. Jazz in the 21st century is as diverse as those who perform it and those who listen to it. The evolution of the blues. Like jazz, the blues originated in the South, developing from such African roots as work songs and field hollers. The blues started out in rural areas rather than cities, sometimes after the Civil War. Blues tunes principally expressed the singer's own feelings and struggles, and the instrument of choice was the guitar. So your own feelings, your struggles, your things that keep you down. Even more than jazz, the blues featured improvisation, with singers making up both the words and melody as they played. Lyrics were often structured with one line being repeated 2 or 3 times, followed by a final line. Most of the early blues players were self-taught, and many could not read music. The blues didn't come out of no book, the 1930 bluesman Big Bill Broonzy once remarked. In the 1920s, blues musicians joined the northward migration to Chicago and other cities. Some of the most famous blues singers during this period were women, including Mamie Smith, who made the first blues record in 1920, and Bessie Smith, who became famous internationally. Born around 1898 to a poor family in Tennessee, Bessie Smith came to be known as the Empress of the Blues. Great influencers. Over the years, jazz and the blues would influence each other's sounds, but the two genres remained distinct. Unlike jazz, the blues never became a national craze. The blues remained popular mainly among African Americans. However, a few blues musicians such as B.B. King, the king of the blues, were able to cross over and appeal to a white audience. In the 1940s, the blues branched out into rhythm and blues, R&B. Both genres influenced the development of rock and roll in the 1950s. Among the pioneers of rock and roll was the African-American singer, songwriter, and guitarist Chuck Berry, who influenced many later rock musicians. Elvis Presley recorded rock songs based on blues tunes, thrilling millions of avid young fans and scandalizing their parents with this energetic sound and his dance moves, swinging his hips. As in the jazz age, parents and churches and other institutions sounded the alarm that the new music would surely warp young minds. Some of the criticisms were even racist in tone. In later decades, rock and roll developed into rock music, which has gone in such diverse directions as heavy metal, alternative, and punk. In rap and hip-hop, listeners can trace the enduring blues elements of protest, personal expression, and irresistible rhythms. At the time, jazz and blues are still going strong in clubs, recording studios, and in the hearts of fans. So that's jazz, a truly American musical form. Take a listen to some songs on YouTube. I suggest looking at B.B. King, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington,